Hi, this is the second lecture on Chapter 6, and we're continuing our work with figures of speech. As I said before, I think it's useful for you to understand the many types of figures of speech that can be used when crafting a poem and can be looked for when analyzing a poem. But for our class, we're going to really focus on these: the simile, the metaphor, including implied metaphor, and personification. In the last lecture, we went over simile with 2 examples. In this lecture, I'll be looking at metaphor, implied metaphor, and personification. Many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with metaphors, have encountered them in other classes, but just to review, a metaphor is declaring that one thing is something else. It's not like something else, but actually is something else. And that relationship can come up in a poem several times, several metaphors. There could be one metaphor dropped in a particular part of a poem, or you might find that an entire poem is an extended metaphor. And then the implied metaphor doesn't make the statement directly that one thing is something else, but it gives us enough information to determine that on our own. And finally, personification, the endowing of a thing, an animal, or an abstract term with human characteristics. It dramatizes the non-human world in tangibly human terms. So let's start with Sylvia Plath's poem, Metaphors. Metaphors. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. Oh, red fruit, ivory fine timbers, this loaf's big with its yeasty rising, money's new minted in this fat purse. I'm a means, a stage, a cow and calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples, boarded the train, there's no getting off. So the first thing that we learn in line 1 is that the speaker is describing herself as a riddle in 9 syllables, and the line actually has 9 syllables. The poem itself is 9 lines long, and 9 months is the typical amount of time that a woman carries a baby to term. So we begin to understand that these are all descriptions of the speaker and how the speaker feels about being pregnant. A riddle in 9 syllables, and now all of these metaphors. I'm an elephant, a ponderous house, so things that are large. Here, a ponderous house, something large that also contains other things. A melon strolling on 2 tendrils, something round with 2 small appendages. And then, oh, red fruit, possibly addressing the baby growing in her womb. Ivory, the color of her skin as she looks down at her pregnant body. And fine timbers, paralleling these 2 tendrils. Fine meaning not just excellent or beautiful, but also thin. And so looking down at her pregnant body, her legs may seem quite thin by comparison. She goes on. This loaf's big with its yeasty rising, another relationship where she is growing larger. Money's new minted in this fat purse. So the body, the womb as the fat purse, and the baby as the new minted money growing inside her. I'm a means, a stage, a cow and calf. This line sets up a relationship where the woman's body is a vehicle for something or someone else, a means to an end, a stage on which others can perform, a cow and calf. Here we finally get an actual birthing image. And then I've eaten a bag of green apples. If you eat a bag of green apples, you're going to have a very bloated, distended stomach. It's going to be very uncomfortable. And so this particular metaphor brings in more discomfort than we've seen in the other metaphors. And then the final line, boarded the train, there's no getting off. We get the sense that once she's pregnant and is going to be giving birth, things are changing and it's out of her control. Plath wrote this poem in 1959 when she was pregnant with the first of her 2 children. And while we can't always draw a direct connection between the poet and the speaker, Plath is known for having written a lot based on her own life, and so I think we could suggest at least that this is some of how she felt about this first pregnancy. Opening with a riddle suggests a tone of playfulness, and certainly some of these metaphors seem quite playful. They're probably not ways that pregnancy has been described before. But then as we get down toward the end, with the green apples and finally the lack of control and the lack of knowing what's going to happen, boarded the train, there's no getting off, there is a sense of anxiety. And you'll have to decide for yourselves when you're reading the poem if you feel like it's more playful or more anxious, or maybe equal parts of both. The next poem by Carl Sandburg is an example of implied metaphor. The Fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches, and then moves on. So those of you who are cat people probably knew immediately that the implied metaphor was that the fog is a cat. And so we get this description of the ways in which the fog is a cat. It comes on little cat feet. It sits and looks in the way that cats do. The silent haunches, and then the movement. And so this implied metaphor is entirely in service of helping us understand this particular type of harbor fog. And finally, an example of personification. The wind. The wind stood up and gave a shout. He whistled on his fingers and kicked the withered leaves about and thumped the branches with his hand, and said he'd kill and kill and kill, and so he will, and so he will. As the book points out, in this instance, the wind is being personified as a wild man. So we have standing, shouting, whistling, kicking, thumping, all of these aggressive actions, loud actions. And then finally, the final 2 lines, and said he'd kill and kill and kill, and so he will, and so he will. There's a sense of almost the wind being out of control. This is definitely a very strong wind, possibly hurricane wind, and the personification just helps us to understand that in winds that strong, things can be fatal, that wind with that power can be very dangerous. And we know that even better by reading this poem with this example of personification. I would encourage you to look back at other poems in the chapter and see what figures of speech they're using, and especially pay attention to the figures of speech we've focused on: simile, metaphor, implied metaphor, and personification.